So the purpose of life cycle value realization is really in the name itself. We want to look at all phases of the life cycle, from creation all the way through to disposal, including operations, maintenance, design, construction, and support. We want to ensure that the performance cost and risk to achieve that sustainable value is balanced. And when we talk about that balance, that could change over a period of time. And of course, from a life cycle value realization, you've got to remember it's the life cycle of a service or product delivery, as well as the asset life cycle that supports them, using a value framework that includes both financial and non-financial drivers. And then finally, tracking benefits and making adjustments wherever necessary to pivot and ensure that value is being achieved. Organizations run the risk that there's a prioritization placed around short-term cost savings, profitability, versus that of more longer-term and sustainable value for an organization. So to combat both short-term versus the long-term perspectives, we need to educate decision makers politely on a whole of life perspective, cost, benefits, showing examples of where things can improve, showing examples of where things might not have gone well in the past, and then avoid risks. Now, again, the context of the organization, a short-term focus might be adequate, but we shouldn't lose sight of the longer term, even if our organization might not be responsible or accountable for beyond a certain threshold. When we're defining value, we need to be careful because in an asset management context, we talk about value of an asset and value from an asset. Stakeholders often interpret value differently, and that's okay. Value is in the eye of the beholder, but we need to make sure that when defining the value, we consider, is it through a financial lens, maybe a social, environmental, customer, supplier lens. So to remedy this, we can co-create, co-design a value framework. Stakeholders can put inputs into what they believe is important to them by way of value, and maybe that's short-term versus longer-term, and then we can bed it into our decision-making framework, our decision-making processes. There's always a risk that functions across the organization will work in isolation, work in silos. This can lead to, and often will lead to, suboptimal life cycle outcomes. So we need to be mindful of this whole cross-functional, cross-disciplinary collaboration. Having a facilitated session that brings in these cross-functional teams, cross-functional areas of the business, analyze and looking at the service life cycle and the asset life cycle, and what are the trade-offs that can actually get us to the outcome. Doing that together, we can move from creativity to collaboration to consensus with a good, robust discussion without argument. The capability, the competency, the confidence, the skills, the gaps that go with that in terms of life cycle management, life cycle costing, can have an impact on value realization, benefit realization. We need to have not just people in finance managing the benefits managing the measurement of benefit tracking. We need to make sure that the rest of the business understands, again, the tension between value of and value from an asset. So if we can provide training and tools for life cycle analysis, and not just digital dashboards that talk about cost, talk about uptime, but really talking about benefits tied back to strategic asset management planning and the asset management objectives that they provide. When an organization starts to move its focus from just looking at the assets, the physical assets, fixing assets, fit, form, and function of assets, to realizing value from the services in which those assets actually support, we can run into a bit of change resistance. Subject matter experts who are used to looking at the world through that lens will think this is all abstract, this is all top management, I'm uncomfortable, and resist. But if we can then remedy that by communicating certain success stories of where it can work, it has been shown to work, and highlight how value realization benefits their role, they can actually hook into the contribution that they make as an individual their division or department or team makes towards that service or the asset lifecycle, all of a sudden that change resistance can be converted from trying to push people through the change to actually them pulling themselves through the change because they actually understand why it's important. A lot of organizations will be always hitting the ground running, make a decision, plan in place, and off we go. But the real risk here is we're not tracking the value that we're receiving from the execution of work, or perhaps a poor asset management decision is going unnoticed or uncorrected. We're drifting further away from really our purpose, and we're sacrificing cost, risk, and performance in doing so, i.e. value. It doesn't have to be overly complicated, but setting up some type of benefit tracking system, and that could be as simple as here are my asset management objectives. They are very much lead indicators. And then from that, I'm going to track against it. Well, all of a sudden, you maintain alignment between strategy, tactical, and operations. But also, too, you have a monitoring and feedback process in place that's very much supporting plan, do, check, and act. From an ISO perspective, there are quite a few elements that really underpin value realization across the life cycle, but two in particular that dovetail nicely into the context of life cycle value realization from a global forum perspective is section 8.1 of the standard, operational planning and control, including life cycle management. And as mentioned throughout this series, when I was the convener, we spent a lot of time making sure we talked about the life cycle of assets, the life cycle of services, to remind top management it isn't just the asset in isolation at a point in time. Section 8.2, controlling of change. Now that's really key as well, because if you have to pivot or making a decision, how does one change? Because if we don't understand that, we don't have capability in that, we can be actually doing more harm to the organization than good. So in summary, life cycle value realization ensures every asset decision contributes to the longer term value, not just short term results. But we need to be very mindful that the organization's long term view is in the context. It doesn't mean that value realization has an infinity about it, but it might be geared back to a contract, a project, or a defined period of time.